Well, the proposal for today, yesterday we were discussing something quite practical here. We talked about time management. And today we are moving on to something a bit more delicate, a bit more complex to understand, which is in essence a little bit of the history of Tibet and fundamentally the story of a book, this one here, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, known as the Bardo Thodol, the Bardo, the passage, the liberation at the moment of death through hearing. We will see what this means, what the purpose of this book is. It is one of the classic works now known in the West, from this tradition of Tibet that remains, even today, so mysterious and obscure. So keep in mind that we have 2 hours. What we can discuss about this in 2 hours is just a brief summary. We won't be able to go into great depth. This course, like all the activities we carry out at New Acropolis, is a small extract of what we offer within the classical philosophy course. In one of the levels of our course, we have a series of subjects called theological symbologies, where we study traditions from both the East and the West, ancient religions that no longer exist today, to understand how they were structured. And one of the traditions we study is also Tibetan Buddhism. So we delve into this in greater detail as it deserves. Today the scope is quite limited. Well, we will basically talk about Tibet. Today, Tibet has come to public attention for 2 reasons. First, China, due to the invasion carried out by China, which generated a great controversy and political discussion, and through the Dalai Lama, his travels around the world, and his peaceful protest against this invasion, as well as all the publicity that has surrounded it. So, what we know today is not much more than these 2 facts. What is Tibet? It is a distant country that, at a certain point in time, who knows why, was invaded by China, and had a religious leader, the Dalai Lama, about whom we sometimes do not even know which religion he belongs to. Oh, it's Buddhism. But Buddhism, is it exactly the same Buddhism that exists in Japan, Zen Buddhism? Is it exactly the same Buddhism that was born in India with Siddhartha Gautama? No, it is a truly unique form of Buddhism, which is the Buddhism of the Gelug school. We will learn a little about this history. I ask for your understanding regarding my pronunciation, because Tibetan is not a language I am proficient in, so I cannot say these words exactly as they should be pronounced. It is quite exotic, isn't it? But the fact is that today we still know very little about it. It is interesting, Helena Blavatsky, the author of the book I mentioned to you, which we will see next week, The Voice of the Silence, traveled through Tibet in the 19th century. At that time, you could count on your fingers the number of Westerners who set foot there, the non-Tibetan people who entered Tibet. Even today, it is still not among the easiest things to do. In fact, reaching Lhasa is still not among the easiest things. Even today, the number of foreigners who travel there is still quite limited, partly because such visits are not particularly encouraged. The policies implemented by China in the Tibetan territory are not very favorable to outsiders, as it is not in their interest for the world to know exactly what is happening there. So even today, Tibet remains very enigmatic, very closed. We do not know exactly what goes on inside, nor do we know what this country is truly like. It's not a small country. It is a nation the size of Western Europe, and 10 times the size of France. It is a vast territory, although its population is small and has been steadily decreasing since the Chinese invasion, as a massive Chinese population was settled in that region, making Tibetans a minority today in their own homeland. Nevertheless, it is an immense territory, a land rich with history. I don't know if you are aware, but many of the civilizations that we now consider and recognize, civilizations with beautiful and enigmatic histories, the names by which we refer to them today are not the names they used for themselves, but rather names given by their conquerors. For example, Egypt. Egypt is hidden and mysterious. It was the Greco-Roman civilization that called Egypt by that name. The Egyptians did not call themselves Egypt. They were the land of Kim. Nor did Tibet call itself Tibet. Today, I believe this idea has already been assimilated, but Tibet means goat. It is the land of goats. So it is a name that was later incorporated, imposed by the invaders, all right? Its etymology is somewhat debatable. They themselves did not call themselves by that name. Another point is that when we first learn about Tibet, we get the impression that Tibet, well, everything they had, they were a barbaric people with very little culture, very sparse, and that everything they received came from India. This is one of the most debatable ideas that exists. Today, even historians themselves no longer assert this with such certainty, because traditions say that, in fact, the opposite happened more often. Much of what India received actually came from the influence of Tibet, which has always been a land devoted to mysteries, dedicated to sages. Because just imagine, it is an inhospitable place. If you wanted to isolate yourself, to be in a safe place where you could devote yourself to your meditations and reflections without anyone interrupting you, Tibet was an excellent candidate. a place cut off by several mountain ranges, the most famous of which is the Himalayas. An average altitude of 4,500 meters. A temperature that can reach minus 30 degrees Celsius in winter. Dry, extremely dry. Certain regions are absolutely unsuitable even for life itself, very challenging. A place that remains difficult to access even today, so a very isolated place. Precisely because it is so isolated, for a long time it has been said that Tibet was the chosen place for those who wish to withdraw in order to dedicate themselves to meditation, to the pursuit of a deeper knowledge of themselves, and to self-knowledge. In other words, many masters of wisdom withdrew to Tibet. Tibet has always been closely associated with this idea of mystery and wisdom. One thing that students sometimes ask me is, why is it that throughout history we hear about schools and masters, not only in the East but also in the West, for example Pythagoras and other Western schools, even in Egypt itself, that would isolate themselves from public knowledge? Seems as if they were hiding. Selfish, egotistical, right? They didn't want to share this knowledge with us. Why would they do that? In general, when humanity declines, my friends, there is a characteristic that is terrible, but you must agree that it is a fact. When humanity declines, it tends to use knowledge for its own selfishness, and knowledge ends up working more against humanity than in its favor. Plato had a striking phrase in which he said, "Absolute ignorance is preferable to knowledge in the wrong hands." So there has always been, among those who possess greater knowledge than the average, a wisdom that surpassed the ordinary, a concern that was not selfish but rather altruistic. They believed that humanity should not have access to information it could use against itself, like a child holding a sharp knife. What will the child do with it? Inevitably, they will end up hurting themselves. Now, is a sharp knife good or bad? It depends. In the hands of a chef, it is excellent, but in the hands of a madman, or a child who is not prepared to use it, it becomes dangerous. In this way, knowledge is like a sharp knife. It is excellent depending on how it is used. Therefore, many times when humanity declined, you will notice that these schools of wisdom had to conceal themselves. This has occurred many times throughout history, both in the West and in the East. You will see that when Greece declined, one of the first things that happened was that Eleusis and Samothrace, schools of wisdom where Plato and many others studied, disappeared from the map, went into hiding because they began to face even threats to their lives. When Islam declined, the Sufi schools vanished. Many Sufi masters were killed. Thus, these schools have always sought somewhat isolated places, not only to protect themselves, but also to protect humanity from itself. To prevent imparting knowledge to someone who lacks the moral foundation to bear it. An interesting point, which is a reflection we always make in our philosophy courses, by the way. Knowledge, like anything else, as in the example I just gave you about the knife, is not good or bad in itself. What is good or bad is the use that is made of it. So imagine someone who possesses cutting-edge knowledge of atomic physics. Is that good? And if that person is a terrorist, a psychopath, a Nazi, or anything of the sort, wouldn't it be better if they had no knowledge at all? Therefore, there are a series of considerations we must make, and these schools understood this very concretely. The Egyptian school of Hermes Trismegistus spoke about this. The lips of wisdom were joined to the ears of understanding. So, for a variety of reasons like these, Tibet was for a long time a center of great knowledge of many inner schools, and it is said that, and here is something important for you to understand, was Tibet Buddhist? Yes, it was. But before Tibet was Buddhist, it was already Buddhic. It already had an entire tradition. What is the difference between being Buddhic and being Buddhist? Buddhi is a word that means enlightenment, wisdom. Buddhism is what began with the advent of Siddhartha Gautama, a man, a historical tradition. Before there was Buddhist philosophy, there was Buddhic philosophy, which was the one that sought enlightenment through wisdom. Tibet was already Buddhic before it became Buddhist. There was already much there. One of the things we will notice is that the Bardo Thodol was already present in Tibet long before the first Buddhists set foot there. It was a popular tradition passed down from generation to generation, long before the first Buddhist arrived. And when Buddhism arrives, it incorporates itself into all of this tradition. It assimilates all of this tradition. In a very eclectic way, it assimilates everything that was already there, right? So when did the history of Tibet begin? It's difficult for us to know. What is known is that when Buddhism arrived there, it was already a tradition that was somewhat in decline. At least the popular tradition. The religion that existed in Tibet when Buddhism arrived around the 7th century. Some monks, especially from India, began to arrive in that region, When they arrived, the dominant religion was a religion called Bon or Boan, which was a shamanic religion, similar to African religions, where small acts of sorcery and popular magic were practiced. It was already a period of decline in Tibet when Buddhism arrived there. And when Buddhism arrived, it united with the best aspects of those traditions, reclaimed them, and created a Buddhist form that is absolutely unique. This, in fact, is a very special characteristic of Buddhism. Wherever it goes, it adapts to what is already present and creates its own unique way of being, which does not exist anywhere else. In Buddhism, when it passes through Tibet, it merges with the Bon tradition. When it passes through China, it merges with Taoism. When it passes through Japan, it merges with Shintoism. And so you have the Lamaism form of Buddhism, the Chinese Chan school, and Zen Buddhism in Japan. Each place has its own tone, its own unique color. The underlying principles remain the same, but they take on a different hue. Over time, of course, what we have there today is quite different from what existed at the beginning. But in the beginning, there was truly a blended syncretism, where the best of the local elements was incorporated, and the principles of the tradition of Siddhartha Gautama were brought in. So Siddhartha Gautama, an Indian prince, who is the master we popularly know as the Buddha, lived in India in the 6th century before Christ. In the 2nd century before Christ, the first canon was published. A sacred work of Buddhism, which is the Dhammapada, the Pali Canon, began to spread in various directions, especially after an emperor named Ashoka, whom everyone knows as the great defender of Buddhism in India. Today, Buddhism in India accounts for less than 1% of the population. Buddhism did not flourish in India, which was the birthplace of Siddhartha Gautama. It flourished in neighboring regions, and in Tibet it absorbed all that was present there, giving rise to a multitude of traditions. Many masters passed through this land, Padmasambhava Adi Shah, and especially a master who arrived in the 15th century named Tsongkhapa, who was Chinese. He was no longer Indian but Chinese. Tsongkhapa arrives in Tibet and finds a region still deeply troubled. Two traditions were still at war with each other, and he managed to integrate all of this, founding a school, the one we know today through the Dalai Lama, the Gelugpa, or the Yellow Hats. It is not the only form of Buddhism that exists in Tibet. There are at least 3 major schools: the Red Hats, which is the Nyingma, the Sakya, and also the Kagyupa Karma Kagyu, known as the Black Hats. 3 to 4 schools remained active, at least at the time when Buddhism arrived in the region. The most renowned of all is the one we know through the Dalai Lama. The structure of Lamaism or Lamasian Buddhism encompasses 2 branches. I won't delve too deeply here, as we could spend the entire night discussing just how extensively Buddhism has diversified over the course of history. Fundamentally, Buddhism split into 3 main paths: Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And the form of Buddhism that established itself in Tibet is primarily rooted in the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions. I don't want to linger too long on this historical aspect because it can become somewhat monotonous, but it's important for you to have a general overview. What is the fundamental difference between the 2 major branches of Buddhism, Hinayana and Mahayana? Hinayana, or the lesser vehicle, is the oldest school, inspired by the teachings of the Buddha in seeking liberation through wisdom. Its ideal is liberation achieved through wisdom. The wise one, the Arhat, is the individual who attains liberation. What is the difference with Mahayana? Mahayana has an interesting detail. Its entire tradition is fundamentally based on a single phrase from Siddhartha Gautama. He said the following: "I will not rest until I see the back of the last person entering nirvana." Imagine that. I will not rest until I see the back of the last person entering nirvana. This means he assumed that the last person would be whom? Evidently himself, right? So in Mahayana, the ideal is not the person who attains liberation through wisdom, but the one who walks toward wisdom, leaving clear footprints so that others may follow. Their ideal is not the Arhat, but the Bodhisattva, not the person who is liberated, but the one who journeys toward liberation, bringing along as many human beings as possible. It is not simply about individual salvation, it is about fraternity. Thus, it carries a very distinct tone, and this allowed it to achieve a very rapid reach. Mahayana spread quickly. It is one of the traditions that, as you will see, when Buddhism arrives in Tibet, the tradition brought there by Padmasambhava is the Mahayana tradition. The Mahayana school was the one that had the greatest impact in Tibet, as well as the Vajrayana tradition, which is very similar to what already existed there. The Vajrayana tradition, Vajra, my friends, means diamond. In Tibetan, it is called Dorje, the diamond vehicle. You will notice that it is common for great masters in Tibet to have this epithet in their names. Dorje the diamond. They believe that the entire process of human evolution consisted in making one's mind like a diamond. Strong, determined, absolutely solid in its principles, yet transparent and luminous. Absolutely transparent, pure and luminous, but also strong and resilient. We tend to think that pure and transparent things are fragile, don't we? Imagine how these two qualities come together in a diamond. Strong, tremendously resilient. A diamond is capable of cutting glass and at the same time is transparent, clean, and pure. They say that a mind like this allows you to see the world in such a way that anything that happens to you can become favorable. There is, in fact, a saying from the Vajrayana school that I find very beautiful. They say the following: "The good pilot, who knows where his harbor lies, sets his sails in such a way that any wind becomes favorable to him." If I know where I want to go, any event in my life can help me move in that direction. Any event in my life, I can face it in a way that allows me to draw from it the experience that enables me to become more of what I have determined myself to be. Events do not hinder me. They add to my journey. So it is a very interesting perspective to see life's experiences as tools, as opportunities, and not as problems, isn't it? So the Vajrayana school had this. At the beginning, these three traditions come together within Tibet, especially the Mahayana and Vajrayana. So this master Tsongkhapa, who according to Buddhist tradition, well, there would be a whole structure for me to explain to you as well. It is said that Siddhartha Gautama himself, the Buddha, would have returned to the world several times to reform the Buddhist tradition. And one of those times would have been as Tsongkhapa himself. They say that he would have been the Buddha himself, right? This is one of the perspectives, one of the many stories that circulate within Buddhism. Tsongkhapa, then, is the one who builds the entire structure of this lineage that we know as Gelugpa, the Yellow Hats, which is a priestly structure. Tibet was a theocracy. The Lama, the Supreme Lama, who is the Dalai Lama, was at the same time both the temporal leader and the religious leader. He was the ruler of Tibet. And for a long time it was like this with ups and downs. We cannot say that all the rulers of Tibet, the history was, let's say, without turmoil. We had many ups and downs. There were even cases of some Dalai Lamas being assassinated in history for political reasons. So let us not be naive enough to think it was always a paradise. The fact is that there was a very rich religious tradition, with two branches, as is always the case among all these peoples. One was exoteric, which is the popular religion, and the other was esoteric or internal, represented by those monasteries where it is said that much wisdom was preserved. The very heart of Tibet was little known to the public. Well, all of this would eventually lead to our historical moment, to what you already know. The Chinese Revolution, the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, the Kuomintang, the invasion of Tibet, the destruction of most of the monasteries, numbering in the hundreds, the death of many monks, religious persecution, and the cultural dilution that is experienced today. Today, when it comes to Tibet, we can't even say exactly what still remains there, can we? A great deal has certainly been lost, haven't it? So this is, in a very summarized way, an overview of the history of Tibet. Of course, if I were to give a full lecture on history, 2 hours wouldn't be enough, would it? There are so many details. What is most important for us is to understand what it means, the focus of today's talk, what it means to create a book to teach people how to die. The Bardo Thodol, which is a book said to have been compiled by Padmasambhava in the 7th century. Compiled. Until then, this knowledge was passed down through oral tradition. Do not be surprised, because you might ask, did they really transmit such a large book through oral tradition? Well, the Vedas were transmitted orally. The 4 Indian Vedas. It was an obligation for the Brahmins to memorize them. When a tradition is written down, it generally means that the people are in decline. It is no longer possible to rely on people's memory, so it must be written. This is generally how it is among cultures. When a religious book comes to be written, it is because people are no longer vigilant and no longer give sacred things the weight they deserve. Therefore, their memory can no longer bear it. And so, you need to resort to other means due to human weakness. Thus, this book was compiled by Padmasambhava, according to what is said, in the 7th century. But for how long had this been practiced in Tibet? No one knows. What exactly is the Bardo Thodol? Bardo, the word Bardo means crossing, gateway, threshold. So, the Bardo of this room would be the doorway that separates us from the reception area. The Bardo is a threshold between two planes. Do you think a bardo, a threshold, only happens between life and death? We have many bardos and thresholds within our very lives. So it is important for you to understand that everything presented in this book, though it speaks esoterically outwardly about the process of death, applies word for word to the process of life. When you move from one level of consciousness to another, because as we grow, something within us dies to make way for something new that is about to be born. It is an internal war. Something is left behind, something dies to make space for something new that will be born. This, in general, does not happen without struggle, without pain. It is a delicate process, it is a threshold. We experience many bardos throughout life.
And what Tibet taught, especially in this book, is that knowing how to die is a natural consequence of knowing how to live.
We are constantly living through bardos. As the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus used to say, as above, so below. Plato said, man is a microcosm within the macrocosm. The same processes you see occurring on a grand scale, in galaxies and systems, in the life of humanity as a whole, you also witness daily in your own life when you face obstacles in the cycles of life, when you are compelled to adopt a new mindset. We are constantly going through bardos, aren't we? In fact, the Eastern perspective on death is not very similar to our own. I would even dare to say that it is nothing like ours. For them, death, this physical death, is just one of the many deaths we experience throughout life, and perhaps it is not even the most important one, right? Because physical death does not take from us what is most essential, does it? So they consider that there are deaths far more delicate and worse than physical death. So they regard life and death as something very different from what we consider them to be. They do not believe that anything can be extinguished or cease to exist. Death is simply a garment, one that you occasionally wear and occasionally discard.
And knowing how to die is a natural consequence of knowing how to grow, of moving through life while seizing every opportunity to rise to a new level.
Well then, the Bardo Thodol, what was done with this book? It is said that within the Tibetan schools, it was a book used in initiation processes, and externally for the people it was used in the processes of death. What then is initiation?
Has anyone ever heard of the term? It is very common that when you study the history of ancient peoples such as Egypt or Tibet, you hear about this.
Greece itself also had its initiations.
These schools that people refer to as inner schools or schools of initiation, do not confuse them with schools of philosophy.
Philosophy is something else much further down the line. Philosophy is simply a love of wisdom, a simple pursuit of wisdom. Initiation is something else entirely. These were schools where, generally, people of a certain level of wisdom would create an entire system designed to accelerate the process of human development, so that the individual could then guide others. Imagine a life experience that would take you 10 years to live through. Through a master-disciple relationship within a monastic environment, this process was shortened to a year, or perhaps even less, creating the conditions for you to reach that state of consciousness in a much shorter time. So it is said that sacred books were used. The voice of the silence, which you will see next week, was used for this purpose. And the Bardo Thodol was also used for this, to guide the process of transitioning human consciousness from one level to another, especially when this needs to be done more quickly than usual. This was done with a single objective, so that the human being would acquire enough wisdom to guide other human beings. It was not for selfish reasons or to stand out, but so that there could be leaders to guide humanity, right? This was used within the schools for that purpose. And within society, yes, it was used in actual processes of death. When a person entered a state of agony, was dying, a lama or any monk would be called, and this monk, ideally, would arrive while the person had not yet completed their process of dying, taking the body while it was still in agony, before the process of death was complete. All these traditions speak of something very interesting. The ideal in the process of dying is that it happens consciously. In fact, all traditions place great value on consciousness. Evolution is nothing more than the evolution of consciousness. This officiant would try to keep the person conscious until their final moments. So, according to the process I mentioned to you, the classic one, this lama would arrive and begin the reading while the person was still in agony. And this reading would continue for 49 days. This is the process of the Bardo. Every day, even after the body was no longer present. Each day, the officiant would come to the person's home and read a passage from the Bardo. Every day for 49 days. You will see that this is something very interesting because 49 is an unfolding of 7. It is a multiple of 7. And 7 is one of the most classic numbers in most traditions. in the theologies of various peoples throughout human history.
There are countless traditions that regard 7 as a sacred number, which is the combination of 3, representing the spiritual, and 4, representing the material.
So 7 is a sacred number for many traditions. And this Bardo, then, is read over a period of 49 days, which is the unfolding of 7. And then comes a series of details, a series of elements for each of these phases. Do you have any questions so far? Yes, go on. Bardo means portal, and Thodol?
Thodol is the doctrine of liberation through hearing, in the stage of the Bardo, the crossing.
It is doctrine.
Thodol is essentially a doctrine of liberation through hearing and vision.
An interesting point that the Bardo mentions, which by the way you will find in many other traditions, is that when a person passes away, understand that, for this tradition, the human being possesses a denser body.
And a spiritual part, which I won't go into much detail about, but which many traditions, including the Indian tradition itself, represent as a triangle.
Notice how the triangle is associated with the number 3. The number 3 is connected to the sacred in many traditions. These are the triads, the trinities: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva.
Ormas, Mazda, Mitra. There are, in short, many traditions that link the number 3 with the sacred.
Not only the 3 as Trinity, but also the geometric 3. It is the Egyptian pyramid, the cornucopia, the cone of the selves. The number 3 is often associated with the spiritual, and the number 4, which is the square, is often linked to the material world to which humanity is bound. Not only the 4 is in the 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, but also the 4 is a geometric element, the cube. Then you might ask, which tradition works with the cube? I've never seen that in my life. I've seen the pyramid. I've seen the cone. But the cube? Which theology works with the cube? You've never seen it, have you? Who here had a childhood and played with those little activity magazines that always came with those games where you had to assemble those little dice?
What does a die look like when it's unfolded?
Isn't it like this? Do you recognize this symbol from anywhere? It's a Christian cross. It's the crucifixion. It's being bound to the material world, right? So it's very common. If you notice, this is one of the things we do in the philosophy course, comparative study, right?
And according to this tradition, this lower quaternary, which we are calling the personality, was composed of 4 vehicles that I won't go into too much detail about. I'll mention them briefly. They are a physical body, an energetic body, an emotional body, and a mental body.
All right, these are the 4 elements. And it was considered that at times a person possessed this vesture. At other times they would lose it, because in truth what we truly are is this here. It is our essence. And this here is merely a garment. So imagine the following: you are out for a walk, and sometimes does it get cold? You put on a coat. Sometimes it gets warm and you take off that coat.
But you remain the same through the summers and winters of existence.
In the winters of existence, you clothe yourself with a heavy cloak. In the summers of existence, you shed it, but you never cease to be who you are. Thus, life is continuous in cycles of life and death of the personality. For the Eastern tradition, death does not exist in the way we conceive it.
So they would say that at a certain moment, even when a human being loses this here, they would remain conscious. Their consciousness would remain continuous.
Well, in Tibet, the Tibetan tradition is a reincarnationist tradition.
They believe that many times a person will have a garment of this kind, and then their consciousness returns to its essence and comes back down here and returns to the essence, right?
So, the process of the Bardo occurs when the human being finishes leaving behind what we call the personality, the quaternary. Personality is a word that has nothing to do with this story here. I'm simply using it because it's more common in our vocabulary, but it's a Greek word. It comes from persona, meaning mask. So it's the mask that actors used in Greek theater. They consider that all of our denser physical aspect is a mask, which you wear on the stage of life, but when you go backstage, you do not cease to exist. Simply, the mask falls away.
And soon after, you step onto the stage and put on another one, right? So they said that when a human being leaves behind their personality, they still retain a strong sense of identity with it.
That's why there's the story of the Thodol, the doctrine through hearing, Because throughout the ceremony, the officiant uses the physical name the person had when they were alive. The person still identifies with this and still listens.
So, they are still able to identify with the physical name they used in life, up until the process of the next reincarnation.
According to this tradition, forgetting does not occur at the moment of death, but it would happen at the moment of returning to inhabit a new body. So throughout all these 49 days, the officiant reads the bardo speaking the name, "O noble child so-and-so. This moment you see such a thing. Do such a thing. But millimeter by millimeter. On the first day, this is what will be happening. On the second day, this is what will be happening. You are seeing such a thing."
What is curious about this process, friends, is that throughout the Bardo Thodol, they instruct the person to understand that what they are seeing is not real. It is an illusion, a mental illusion.
You are the one creating this. It is curious, this within the heart of a religion.
Well, this is not real. This is a projection of your mind. Do not believe it. At no point do they say, "This exists, this is real, this is truly so." No.
Do not believe it. You are seeing this because you believe in it.
If you do not believe, it disappears. This is a projection of your mental forms.
So, with a lucidity and a level of discernment that is truly uncommon, it stands above any particular theological affiliation. They are very sober-minded. It is quite fascinating, isn't it?
So, this is the moment when a person passes away.
Then comes the entire process, which is very interesting for us to understand. According to what is said, there are three fundamental stages.
There is one stage that is the moment when the person passes away, which describes the sensations at the moment of death. Even this is described in the Bardo. It explains what a person physically feels at the moment they are leaving the body.
So they say that fundamentally the following happens. The person feels a pressure, as if their chest is being pushed downward underwater, which represents earth dissolving into water. Then comes a damp cold, followed by a burning heat, which is water dissolving into fire. After that, the body feels as if it is exploding into atoms, which is fire dissolving into air. And then, after this passage, this process in which these physical sensations occur, it is said that the most important stage of the Bardo follows, which is the Chikai Bardo. It is the first Bardo. It is the Bardo of the moment of death. This Bardo of the moment of death, well, evidently, within such a tradition, people did not have watches. But how would they say how long something lasted? They would say, "Look, it lasts as long as a meal." That was their unit of measurement. It was impossible to know whether they ate quickly or slowly.
If it lasts, the time of a meal, which is a moment when the person begins to disidentify from the body.
It is said that the so-called primordial clear light appears, and then the secondary clear light. Imagine the following: a rubber ball. When you throw it on the ground, the highest bounce it makes is right after it falls for the first time, isn't that so? After that, the height of the bounce decreases. It is said that the most special experience one has or can have is precisely this immediate moment after passing away, which is called the primary or primordial clear light. What does the person see? Do you know what? Absolutely nothing. Only light, right? Nothing. The primordial clear light is a vast, luminous emptiness. And it is said that this is the greatest opportunity the consciousness of the departed has to encounter the divine, if they identify with it.
But generally, since no one identifies with it, they end up feeling lost in the emptiness and flee from it.
Then comes a lesser illumination, a dimmer light, which is called the secondary clear light.
The person also fails to recognize it and flees from that as well. Then they enter another stage, which is called the second Bardo. Just this detail to explain to you.
Afterwards, we'll take a short break. Imagine what this tradition is telling us. That the greatest opportunity for a human being is to encounter a luminous emptiness and to identify with it. You will see that, according to these Eastern traditions, and we will study this next week, as you will see in the Voice of the Silence, the greatest evil of humanity, from which all other evils arise, is something called the heresy of separateness. Do you know what the heresy of separateness is? It is when I think that I am one person, you are another, and we have nothing to do with each other. They say that this way of thinking is the root of selfishness. Wanting things only for myself, of violence. Believing I can take things from others. Thinking that something can be good for me and bad for someone else. Of indifference and all the evils in the world. It all stems from the heresy of separateness. They say it is an alienation, a madness of humanity, that this does not exist except in a world of fiction, of unreality. And in reality, it is only ignorance that makes us see the universe as many, and not as one. This is a highly metaphysical concept. If I can get you to understand just this today, I will already leave here very happy. Imagine the following, for example. This is something we always mention, and it's even included in one of our study guides. Imagine that you are standing at the edge of a beach. Then you go and run your finger through the sand, making a groove. Then you go and run your finger through the sand again, making another groove. What impression do you get? There are two grooves, right? But what is the first groove made of? Of sand. And the second one, sand. And the space between them, sand. Momentarily differentiated. The entire universe would be divine, a part of the body of a great being, the divine macrobios. You and I would be episodes of a single being. And if I know this, for me to wish you harm would be madness. For me to desire to possess things that you do not have would be madness. It is as if my hand wished harm upon my foot. If both know they belong to the same body, this is absurd because the hand knows that harm to my foot can spread throughout the whole body and end up affecting itself, isn't that so? Or as if my hand wanted to possess my foot. How could that be? If both belong to a single body. When a person realizes they are part of a whole, where they are but an episode of this divinity, at a crossroads of space and time, how can they feel separate from those around them? From the beings around them? How can they believe that things make sense only for themselves? That success is only for themselves, that recognition is only for themselves? How can they think that someone else's loss could bring them benefit? All the alienations that arise from this, when a person believes they are separate from things. This is a concept that is not only Tibetan. You will see that the East in general holds this perception of unity. Pythagoras worked with this idea of unity, and that separateness is merely an illusion, a mere illusion that serves a purpose, to generate a certain level of consciousness. However, one must always remember, just like that Greek theater actor I mentioned to you, I step onto the stage and play my role, but I know that I am not that role. This is something temporary because what I am is behind the scenes. So, play your role in the best way possible without identifying with that mask, without falling into separateness. When a person identifies with the whole and perceives the whole, which is this great luminous radiance, they move toward it. Do you think a selfish person moves toward the whole? He runs away from it. He wants only himself. Notice, everyone, something interesting. When you walk down the streets, when you receive a flyer for a university course, or for any kind of professional training, what is it that society usually encourages in you? Things just for yourself. Distinction. And individual success. In fact, the very word distinction is already curious, isn't it? Because if you stand out, it means a whole bunch of things were left behind. For one person to succeed, many must fail, because otherwise his success has no flavor. So we live in a society that encourages our selfishness, that stimulates our weaknesses. This is the worst kind of manipulation. Manipulation consists precisely of this, reinforcing the weaknesses of others. For what purpose? To exploit them through those weaknesses, to lead them. So every kind of selfishness, every promise society makes of success is based on this. They are quick, easy things and only for you. So within a mindset like this, a person is confronted with a luminous whole, light in all directions. The tendency is to run away from that. At some point, it is said that human consciousness will awaken when one sees the whole moving toward them, to desire to move toward the whole, to wish to be a drop of water within the ocean. Feel what this means for you, for your own consciousness. Society comes and says, look, if you succeed, if you do the things we are telling you to do, in 10 years, everyone will be talking about you. You will be successful, you will stand out. Then you come before a tradition that tells you, look, if you succeed in what we are proposing in 10 years, you will be even more anonymous than you are today. Much more. But you will be closer to unity, to the whole, which is what truly corresponds to you as a human being. Imagine what a reversal of mentality something like this represents. So it is said that rarely only high-level sages, when they see this luminous whole, say, yay, and they go towards it. Most people run away from it. This is said to be the first and most important experience, the confrontation of unity. It is said that at this point human consciousness could already free itself from incarnations, from sasra as it is called, which is the manifested world. However, it is very rare for someone to attain liberation. After this first stage of the primordial and secondary clear light, one enters a stage of unconsciousness, which lasts about 3.5 to 4 days, and then the second bardo begins, known as the Shianite bardo. Do you realize that these teachings apply both to death and to life? Everything we are discussing follows exactly the same principle. How can a person walk the path and strive for unity after death if they never did so at any point in life? If they have no perception of unity? If you spend your whole life thinking selfishly, well, no one evolves simply because they have died. If that were the case, we would have already solved humanity's problem. All we would need to do is for everyone to die. Death is not evolution. So if you are selfish in life, what will you be after life? Selfish. And you will carry this selfishness with you, and your reactions will be selfish, right? So, in general, this first moment, which is the greatest opportunity, is missed by almost everyone. In fact, it is said that the bardo is an auxiliary process. But if a person was not educated in the science of living, what the bardo can do is very secondary. It is the last attempt to try to help the person recover, regain a bit of the knowledge they received in life. But as long as a person who in life refused any process of deep self-knowledge or understanding of life, during death, the bardo does not work miracles, right? So the difference is actually very small. Whether or not they have read the bardo, a person who is instructed in life and knows how to live will know how to die, regardless of having read the bardo. It is the final attempt that is made. In fact, it is said that the bardo is more effective for life than for death. It does not work miracles. It will not make anyone recover a wisdom that the person did not acquire. Nature does not give shortcuts. So, after this initial process where the person begins to regain some lucidity, they will enter the second stage, which is the Shianite bardo, correct? This Shianite bardo, as I mentioned to you, is usually given an approximate duration of 3.5 to 4 days. The person begins to perceive sounds, to see images, an element that I am trying to present to you in a natural way. I hope I can succeed. Imagine the following, based on what I mentioned a little while ago. Physical body, emotional body, energetic body, emotional body, and mental body. According to this tradition, human beings create on all these planes, and this is entirely natural. You create things on the physical plane. Your energy creates energies. Your emotions create an environment. They create emotions. They generate emotions in others. And what about your mental forms? They create mental forms. Thoughts for them have substance. They have reality. They have existence. They are mental forms, and if I could see on this mental plane, I would see your thoughts all revolving around you. They have substance. They are made of matter. The mind is a substance. Just as physical matter is a substance, emotions are a substance, and the mind is a substance. So when you create a thought form, it has reality, it has substance. Why don't you see it? Because we are protected by the physical body. When you free yourself from the physical body in the process of death, you see these subtle planes. Then you see your own thought forms. Do you imagine that if you could see your thoughts right now, all of them would be very cute and pleasant? Our thoughts. Imagine you see all of them spinning around you, and they will spin because they are yours. So they are like your children. All of them will spin around you. Not all of them are so cute, though. These are the hallucinations of the second bardo, which is the Shianite bardo. A person begins to see their mental forms and does not recognize them as their own, and starts to feel a terrible fear of them. They become frightened by them. The illusions of the bardo, the whole time the officiant begins to say, "Oh, noble child, do not be deceived. The beings around you are not real beings. They are projections of your own mind." And it is very interesting that it is said that you will see that many projections will appear according to the culture to which the person belongs. So there are many deities and monsters from the tradition of Bon Buddhism, from Tibetan Buddhism. If it were a Christian, they would see heavens and hells. If it were, say, a Muslim, they would see that paradise, the garden of Allah, or whatever it is that the person believes in. An absolute materialist who believes in nothing would see emptiness, as if dissolving, if that is what they believe. So a person will see their own mental forms because it is they who are projecting them. It is a mental world. When you lose all these denser vehicles, you remain in this mental world. Your experience will take place here, all right? Once these denser vehicles are lost, your consciousness stays within the mental plane. According to this tradition, within this mental plane, you will live an experience until you return to a new process of life, to once again have denser vehicles. And within the mental plane, you perceive mental forms as if they were real entities, right? And Lucia, would these thoughts be related to before he died? While alive. It was what you thought before, what you resonated with, while alive. Oh yeah. They are your mental forms. And can we destroy them then? I don't know if you've noticed, but she asked an interesting question. Can you destroy your mental forms? Yes, you can. You notice this especially with one of the most complicated things there is, circular thinking. You keep feeding it, and it keeps revolving around you, demanding more nourishment. It becomes such a challenging thing that when you decide to cut it off, you feel it trying to find gaps in your inattention to slip back in, almost like an addiction. You experience withdrawal symptoms. It keeps searching for openings to return. Have you ever noticed that? You're caught in circular thinking. Let's say you're angry at someone, you went through an experience and that person did something to you and you've been thinking negatively about them for days. You decide, I won't think about this anymore. Then you start trying to focus on something else. Look, what a beautiful day. Look at how beautiful this tree is. I've seen a tree like this somewhere before. Oh, there's one on such and such street. That street is near another street, which is close to so-and-so's house. I hate so-and-so. That's how it goes, isn't it? The mind makes these associations that are just incredible. It keeps pulling things out, bam. So mental patterns are complicated, they're heavy. And our emotions and feelings, they are not going to help in this case, right? In fact, when you look at this, wow, this alone could be the subject of an entire course. You'll notice that when you have a mental pattern, there's a chain reaction between the mind and the emotions. When you have a thought, in a fraction of a second, it tenses the emotional side and generates a feeling. A negative thought, okay, you're angry or you're depressed or you're sad. Like, it's like a label that gets attached to that mental form. Okay, there you go. You attach the label. If you're quick, you can cut off the mental form before it has a chance to tense the emotional side. Have you noticed that? It's easier to cut off the mental than to cut off the emotional. If I have a negative thought and I cut it off quickly, I can do it. Now, once it has already generated anger, that anger is like spilling a bucket of paint. Cleaning it up takes work. There's a whole cycle. Emotion is denser than the mind. To get rid of a feeling of anger or a bad mood, the cycle is much longer than simply cutting off a mental form. That's why it's necessary to be quick on the trigger. A mental form appears, bam. Cut it off quickly. If you cut it off quickly, you don't give it time to tense up your emotions. The emotional always follows. It always comes attached. It hangs a label on the mental forms. What is the real necessity, the relevance of the officiant, of the monk in the process, in the passage? He tries to imagine that you have a horizon of possibilities. Nothing is ever that exact. Of course, a person who has led a very trivial life will not arrive and identify with the primordial clear light. That is too much for them. But there is a horizon of the maximum possible and the minimum possible. He tries to maximize that person's possibilities within what he is able to offer. You will see that he does not give up until the very last moment. The 49 days, it is said that, except in two extreme cases, a person rarely reaches the full 49 days. Either when someone is very virtuous or when they are very unvirtuous, these are the extreme cases. Normally, the Bardo ends halfway. The person is liberated along the way, identifying with some plane. We will explain this in just a moment. One only reaches the 49th day in the worst or the best cases. We will explain why. So, in this Kanad Bardo, the person will begin to have visions. One very interesting thing about the Kanad Bardo is that it lasts 14 days. There are the first 7 days, during which you see the so-called benevolent deities, and the following 7 days, when you see the wrathful, angry deities. These are the benevolent visions and the wrathful visions. What does this mean? It is said that within the human being, by nature, all the divine attributes exist. A person possesses will, love, intelligence, generosity, and also malice. All of these qualities reside within a human being. And the absence of these qualities creates a shadow zone, which are the vices. It's not that you lack these things, but rather that you have not yet consciously experienced them. You have not yet made use of these tools. Thus, within himself, a person carries both light and shadow. At every moment, depending on one's level of ignorance or wisdom, one draws more from one or the other. But you possess these elements within yourself. So it is said that in the first 7 days of the Kanad Bardo, you will witness these virtues. You will perceive the mental plane through the heart, and you will see these virtues represented in what you recognize as divine. So, if you are a Christian, you will see saints or whatever is meaningful to you. Depending on your tradition, you will see forms that represent these virtues for you. Then you will notice that for 7 days in the Tibetan tradition, the deities of Tibet begin to appear.
Thus, the Vyani Buddhas, surrounded by a multitude of masculine and feminine divinities, form the mandalas of the Bardo. Those deities begin to appear. Every day a new one appears. Each of them represents a virtue, radiant and full of light. If you have cultivated any of these virtues to a certain degree, one of these Buddhas will draw you in, and you will move toward it.
And this would be a...
It is a mental form you have created to physically represent that virtue. So imagine I say to you fraternity. If you are Muslim, you will think of Muhammad. If you are Christian, you will think of Jesus Christ. Well, if you are Tibetan, you will certainly think of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara.
So before you, a mental form will appear, one you have created to embody that virtue which radiates from within you.
They are clear about this. They reveal everything that is radiating from your heart, right?
So these virtues begin to appear to them successively, one per day for 7 days. Each of them is represented by a figure from the central Tibetan pantheon, surrounded by many deities. It is a mandala.
Is that clear? Each one always represents an element: love, compassion, beauty, harmony, and justice.
For 7 days, the virtues present themselves in divine forms.
And it is said that these mandalas are extremely luminous and beautiful.
Around them, there is a zone of shadow, a very pale light and shadow, which is the counterpart of the light. It is the shadow. So, when a person, let's say you are someone exceptionally fraternal, a deity representing fraternity appears before you.
You tend to feel drawn toward it. If you move toward it, it is said that you will identify with this deity at a certain level, and then you will experience your bardo. We will understand this. This is the moment when you free yourself from the process of the bardo. You identify with this deity and remain there. Now, it is said that when a person has not developed that virtue, instead of running toward the light, they will run toward the peripheral zone of shadow. When he sees the light, instead of feeling drawn to it, he feels fear. He runs toward the peripheral zone of shadow. In life, this is what the officiant keeps saying all the time. In life, if you identified with the light, you will go to the light. If you identified with the shadow, you will go to the shadow. So let's say the first day, compassion.
I fled from compassion, I went to the shadow. I am selfish.
Second day, generosity.
Third day, justice. And I will run away, running. During these first 7 days, these deities present themselves in a benevolent form, seen through the heart. In the following 7 days, they are the same deities, the same virtues, but now they are no longer seen through the heart. They are seen through the mind.
They were seen as kind, wonderful, and attractive.
From the perspective of the mind, they are terrifying. They seek to end you, to destroy your individuality, to take away what you have attained.
So the same deities, when perceived by the mind, become horrifying. Thus, there are 7 days during which you encounter these same deities, now from the vantage point of the mind. Then, on the 8th day, it is the Buddha of compassion, but in order to be compassionate, he is destroying your possessions, your interests, your physical body. It presents a terrifying vision, where that same divine being has now become a monster, destroying everything, drinking blood, bringing everything to an end. Can you imagine? This is something terrible.
This, according to the Tibetan tradition, it is the same divinity, now perceived from a negative perspective, as the destroyer of your interests, your passions, your weaknesses.
Now it is the personality that is observing it.
And then, naturally, the tendency is for you to become even more afraid and to flee from it.
If within you there already exists a certain degree of weariness, where at a given moment you realize that this being is destroying your selfishness, you say, wow, I have wanted to free myself from this selfishness my entire life. It will help me. You feel drawn to it. But if you are identified with selfishness, it appears as a monster. You run to the peripheral zone of shadow. If at any moment you engage in a struggle against a particular flaw, you will perceive that being as an ally.
Otherwise, you will see it as a monster. Either you identify with the flaw or with the one who fights against the flaw.
Depending on your identification, it will either be beneficial or it will appear as a monster. And so the person continues to flee to the zone of shadow until reaching the 14th day. Then you are seeing yourself, your virtues, and your flaws. On one side, you see the deities embodying what is best within you. On the other hand, you see these same deities battling against what is worst within you. They are beneficial in both cases. It is simply that in some cases they appear pleasant, and in others they do not. Thus, the 14 days are intended to offer you an opportunity whether it is because you have identified with the positive or because you have become saturated with the negative. If in none of these opportunities you recognize yourself, you will lose the 14 days of the Bardo, and the karmic weight begins to draw the person downward.
In other words, the person feels an increasing yearning because the Bardo brings a sense of fear, of anguish. They begin to long for a physical body.
This keeps pulling them further and further downward. So this is the process of the Khanid Bardo.
It is the process of confronting illusions with these mental forms, which do not cease there, but are fundamentally present in that space.
It is the confrontation of the person with their luminous aspect and their shadow aspect, as if it were not themselves, as if it were something external, right?
If they do not identify with anything that aligns with their evolution, they pass through the Khanid Bardo.
After 14 days, they will enter a third phase. I told you that when you reach the Sitpa Bardo, you are already halfway through the process.
Those who reach the end of the process are either very crude people or very good people. What does that mean?
The great masters, those high-ranking lamas, had a commitment to humanity. In fact, this is a process still used today within Lamaist Buddhism, where they vow not to rest between one life and another.
They would pass away and reincarnate immediately to continue working for the betterment of humanity. So it is said that in these exceptional cases, they forego the rest between one life and another and remain only 49 days before incarnating again.
By merit, they choose to reincarnate quickly out of merit. So these individuals reach the 49th day and then return. This is the positive case. But there is also the negative case. This is the person who is so attached to the physical body that they cannot bear the idea of resting between one life and another without having a physical form. Their attraction to matter is so strong that within 49 days, they are already gravitating back toward it.
And the process of reincarnation can also be very rapid in these cases. So these are cases of extreme materialism and extreme spirituality. And what about all the intermediate cases, those of ordinary people? They are the ones who tend to spend a significant amount of time in the Bardo.
It is important that you understand what this means.
According to this Eastern tradition, the process between one life and another is a process of rest. It is said that the material experience is so dense, so heavy, that between one life and another you would need a process of rest and purification, so that you could return as cleansed as possible, with better chances to continue evolving. That the earthly experience is a dense experience. Thus, between one life and another, the ideal would be for you to remain in a period of rest 10 times longer than the lifetime you had.
That would be the ideal. So, a good process, which they call devotion. A good process between one life and another would be 700 years, 1,000 years. The ideal would be for a person to return pure enough to register new experiences without the traumas of an entire lifetime. Try to understand this. Imagine your own life, this physical life. Aren't there certain moments when we stop to remember the foolish things we've done? It hurts so much that we find ourselves thinking, my God, I wish I could forget. I wish I didn't remember that I once made such a big mistake. Right? Traumas remain, ruptures remain.
Now imagine, according to a tradition like this, that a person evolves with each incarnation.
So what we are today is the best we've been so far. Just imagine what might have come before this. Imagine if you could remember all of that. The pain it would bring. So it is said that the process of death is a merciful process to erase these harsh memories and leave only the essence of the experience. Only what you have learned from the experience remains. This is a very interesting point that the Tibetan tradition presents. It says the following, that the ideal process for a human being would be that in each experience, they could keep what they learned from it and forget the price they paid for it. If they were able to do this, they would not need death.
Do you understand? Imagine the example I was just giving him outside a moment ago.
Imagine that you are walking happily down a street, distracted, lost in thought, as people often say, thinking about nothing at all.
Suddenly, bam! You twist your ankle, step into a hole, and sprain your foot. What part of this event is a superficial and fleeting memory?
Wow, what a nuisance! This street is full of potholes. Look at the city administration in Brasilia. They never fixed this street. I broke the heel of my shoe, I lost track of time, how absurd. In short, all this complaining is an external fleeting memory. And what would be the essential memory of this event? What truly matters about this event? What does it have to teach you? If you reflect on this event, what conclusion will you reach? That inattention leads to pain. Isn't that right? Is inattention a negative thing? It causes pain. If you reflect on this event, you extract its essence and learn from it.
And according to this tradition, which is a reincarnationist tradition, on another occasion, you would still carry this with you in another life.
You would already begin more attentive than someone who has not lived through this experience. Now, what would be ideal?
It would be ideal if the human being, still within this same life, 10 or 20 years from now, became an attentive person, but did not remember the pain they went through, did not recall the price they paid for the experience.
Because the price of the pains you pay through your experiences ends up forming traumas. It's as if you were dragging a ball and chain, my friend. After a while, you can no longer move forward. Someone comes up to you and says, "Wow, you are such a balanced and composed person." And she replies, "Oh, my dear, you have no idea how much I suffered to get here. Sit down and I will tell you all about it. That endless string of miseries and suffering. Isn't that right? This is a burden, a weight that at a certain point no longer allows a person to move forward. Then death comes and look, it frees you from that weight.
But the essential, it cannot take away from anyone.
And for that, you must have drawn the essential from the experience. Because not everyone who twists their ankle comes to the conclusion that it was due to their own carelessness. This requires attention, reflection, because not everyone engages in this kind of reflection about life. This is what Plato called reminiscence, that essence, that distillation of life that nothing and no one can take from you. So, it is said that at a certain point the human being needs death. Death is a merciful hand, so that it erases the weight paid for experiences and leaves only the distillation, the essence.
And the time for this to dissipate, because as you saw, Bardo says that memory is not lost at the moment of disincarnation.
Memory is lost at the moment of return. So the time it takes for this memory to fade is 10 times longer than the time it took you to create it.
Have you ever noticed how easy it is to stain a piece of clothing and how difficult it is to wash it afterwards?
To remove that stain.
In other words, cleaning is generally more laborious than making a mess. It seems that this is a process that applies to all planes of existence.
So a person would remain in this mental plane. Our consciousness would stay within this mental plane. Now, this mental plane has several levels. There are 7 levels. What does that mean? It ranges from the most elevated and noble thoughts to the most crude and base ones.
At which level of the mental plane will you remain?
The one where you have always been. Because you are not promoted simply because you died. Have you always had base thoughts? Then you will remain on a very crude, very base mental level. And so you will experience your interval between one life and another. Have your thoughts been somewhere in between? Then you will remain at an intermediate level. Have you had very noble, very elevated thoughts? Then you will remain in a plane of noble and elevated thoughts. And then you will share with all those beings who vibrate at the same frequency as you. And at a certain point, that experience is exhausted and you return to incarnate. Now, there are those cases I mentioned to you where a person has such a great need for material experience that not even at this basis level are they satisfied. They truly want to return. This is the level of the coarsest materialism. These are the ones who, by the 49th day, are already searching for a body, right? This is the 3rd stage of the Bardo, known as the Sitpa Bardo. Did you understand this idea of the Shonic Bardo? Illusions. It is a world of illusions, where the person sees themselves, their positive side and their shadow side, and makes a choice. And according to this choice, the person will fit into one of these 7 levels here, known as devotion, and will exit this Bardo process, right? When you identify with something, it recognizes the Bardo process, you enter that level, and there you will have an experience however many years it may last. Until the next time.
So, if I identify with one of these divine beings, I leave that Bardo process, enter a certain mental frequency, and I will remain there.
If I don't identify with anything, I continue descending through the Bardo. Do you see? So the Bardo can be interrupted at any moment.
If I identify on this plane, I enter the heart of one of those Buddhas, whether they are benevolent or fearsome.
I entered the heart of one of these beings.
Well, I entered a certain plane, and there I will identify myself, and there I will live out my experience through a process that is not truly an experience. There is no evolution on this plane.
This, according to the tradition, is merely a process of purification. Evolution happens here with all the vehicles present only on the mental plane, all right? At that level where you are accustomed to vibrating and where you have your identity, right? There you remain.
From the highest, which are those most wondrous mental planes, these, it is said, gave rise in the West to the idea, the myth of paradise, to those coarser mental planes, which they call Kamaloka, that gave rise to the idea of hell, a place of desires.
Imagine a person who thinks only about the lowest things. Well, they will enter the Bardo plane, the mental plane with which they have affinity. Then we think, that's hell. But not for them, otherwise they wouldn't be there. They are there because they like it, because they identify with it. Hell is for us who do not like it. They are there out of identification. Continuing, according to this tradition, the person who passes through the Kanad Bardo and still does not identify with any plane would enter the third phase, which is called Sitpa Bardo. This is indeed a lucid stage where you will see that it is very interesting how many of the traditions that we see echoed in the so-called Semitic monotheisms in the West are closely related to Eastern symbolism.
Here enters the symbolism of the final judgment, which she was asking about. The Sitpa Bardo is when the person begins to feel that attraction to return to the world and have a body.
It is said that in the Bardo, the disembodied consciousness is 9 times more perceptive than your consciousness when it is inside the body.
So the person becomes a kind of paranormal being. They begin to feel an attraction to the physical world, so they start to be able to see the physical world and draw closer to it.
Thus, they are able to see, for example, what their relatives are thinking, what they are doing with their belongings. This can give rise to very negative feelings and thoughts.
To see that no one is suffering all that much, to notice that people are more concerned about their inheritance than missing them, and things like that can begin to generate a deep sense of anguish.
This is the Sitpa stage.
The person begins to hover near the material world and gain some ability to perceive this plane. It is said that since the person no longer has a physical body, they lack a nervous system that would allow them to perceive the light of the sun and the moon.
So they possess what is called the etheric nervous system of the Bardo, and they see everything in shades of gray. Because they do not have a physical body to give them weight, they are subject to the gusts of karmic wind, which toss them here and there. They are unable to remain fixed in one place, right?
And then comes the symbolism that the Bardo presents of the so-called final judgment, which I find very interesting.
It is said that within us there exists a spiritual consciousness, and at this moment it will review your entire life, which is the story of the Lord of Death. The Lord of Death, who is your own spiritual consciousness, will present your life before you as if it were a film.
Then it is said that he places white and black pebbles, marking where there were spiritual intentions and where there were selfish, materialistic, or base intentions, right? And he weighs what was gained, what real growth or addition there was in the life that the person lived. It is very interesting. If you look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it is the same thing. The person stands before Osiris and makes the negative confession, right? I was pure and so on. The weight of the dead person's heart is measured. It is the same thing in the Book of the Dead.
The episode is identical.
So when he arrives, the difference in the Tibetan book is that it says everything is you.
Even the Lord of Death is not Osiris. It is you. It is the divine self that exists within you. This is a very interesting detail because it says that what is reviewed is not what you did, but the intentions and motivations behind your actions. The focus is solely on that. Just that. It reviews the intention that was there, laying it bare. It is said that this is the true process of final judgment, and that it is painful. It is when a person is confronted with the real intentions and motivations that govern their entire life. It is said that very little is actually saved. And even among those beautiful, grand acts, when you look at what lies behind them, vanity, manipulation, passion, very little is preserved.
Because when you stay on the surface in the realm of appearances, there are still a few things that seem acceptable, but when you look deeper, which is what truly matters, what was the real motivation that moved you in your actions toward others?
And look, the white pebble that this is worth is almost nothing at all.
Most motivations were rooted in selfish interests.
It's very interesting. There's a passage from the Bardo that I find beautiful, because it says that this is the most painful moment.
A person must confront the real motivations behind their actions, and this would be far less painful if, during life, they had cultivated the habit of questioning themselves about it.
Always ask, what is motivating me to do these things? What do I truly want with this?
This would lead them to a self-knowledge that would make this process much less painful.
What makes this process painful is the realization of who we truly are, because we wear masks even for ourselves. We camouflage ourselves in the mirror. Sometimes others see us better than we see ourselves. Do you notice that? Sometimes the person next to you knows more about you than you do. They see your manipulations and you do not.
So it is said that the process is extremely painful because human beings do not have the habit in life of questioning themselves about what their true motivations are, right? In another passage, which I find very beautiful in this one, the officiant turns to the disembodied consciousness and says, "Look, if at any moment in your life you had a spiritual master who revealed to you your eternal name, Invoke your eternal name before the Lord of Death, and he will grant you passage.
A very beautiful passage. If at any moment in your life you had any contact, someone, something that put you in touch with your spiritual self, and you did something in the name of that, invoke this before the Lord of Death, for this is your eternal name, it is your spiritual self. Have you ever had any contact with this? Has anyone ever instructed you about this? Have you ever had a spiritual identity? Remember this. Invoke this before the Lord of Death.
This will give disproportionate weight, and he will open the way for you.
Because that is what truly matters in life. I realize my spiritual essence, that which I truly am. This unsettles the balance of the white and black pebbles. He opens the way for you. Oh, is that so? All right, then it was worthwhile. Despite everything, it was worthwhile, right? If you had any contact with your true spiritual essence, any contact with who you really are, your divine self. At some point, some moment of identity, life is justified by that. Then the Lord of Death opens the way for you.
And then after the Siddha process, already bringing the story to a close, right? At a certain point, Siddha will begin to serve, to approach couples who are coming together to conceive children.
And then the officiant tries to avoid it. No, wait a minute. Wait, it is the process of closing the door of the womb. No, it won't. Wait a little longer. And try to prolong the process. Try to prevent him from incarnating so quickly, okay?
But when there comes a certain moment in which he realizes that the attraction to the physical plane is very strong, he begins to guide so that at least he chooses the door of the womb with wisdom.
Look, be careful. Choose a place where people value wisdom. Do not choose fortunes. Choose simple parents, but ones who are virtuous. Be careful, choose such a thing. He begins to guide so that at least the opening of the door of the womb is favorable, so that this person may have good conditions for evolution. When there is no way, there is nothing more to be done.
Until the very last moment, he still tries to close the door of the womb, to prevent the person from incarnating so quickly.
So, when this person is already approaching the 49th day, they begin to hover over the earth. And it's interesting because the Bardo contains some very curious things. It says that the desire for life among the dead provokes sexual desire in the living. So there are still many who wish to live. They begin to hover, and at a certain moment choose by affinity. There is no other way. There is no officiant who can refuse. They choose by affinity the door of the womb, and then they will incarnate.
And then a process begins.
You enter a process of unconsciousness, and when it passes through the door of the womb at that point, there is no use trying to guide it anymore because it loses its identity with its name.
At that moment, the officiant also loses contact. It's over once it enters the womb.
Now it is done. It no longer recognizes the name of its personality, and it loses consciousness. For a time, yes.
For a time, yes. In rare cases, exceptional masters retain consciousness throughout the entire process, but those you do not need to guide because they know what they are doing, right?
It is very interesting. Only in these cases does the reading of the Bardo continue until the 49th day. How do they know this? This is what is so fascinating because in the traditional process, the lamas would observe symbolic events. They were performing the reading of the Bardo. At a certain moment, a flash of sunlight would enter.
They regarded this as a symbolic sign that the person had attained liberation.
The Bardo was no longer necessary. When they incinerated, when they cremated the body, they would observe the shape the bones took. Sometimes the bone would take the form of a symbol.
This was a sign that the person had attained liberation. They had signs indicating that, at a certain point, the person no longer needed the Bardo, because they had already entered another plane. They had already found their place.
If none of these signs appeared, bone relics, the scent of incense, a solar flash, rainbow light, and many other signs. If none of these manifested, they would continue the reading until the very last day, at the same hour until the final day.
When the last day ended, if the person opened the womb door, then it was over. Contact would be lost, and they would already begin another experience. If it was a great monk or a great lama, they would know.
Well, then they would wait 3 or 4 years.
They would take the personal belongings of that deceased monk and look for the child who recognized them, the phenomenon of the tulku.
Whereas for an ordinary person, well, one hopes that the next experience will be better, and thus the Bardo process would come to an end. In truth, they do not consider it a new experience.
They consider that the entire span of life is a single experience. What they believe is that there is a loss of identity with the physical name of the previous personality, and nothing more.
but the human experience itself is one and the same. Well, I do not remember the mistakes I made, but the predisposition to make them remains with me. The lack of skill, the absence of virtue accompanies me as well.
So the experience is the same. You simply do not remember the mistakes you have already made, right? But you carry with you the virtues you have accumulated, as well as the shortcomings you possess. You will simply have a new vehicle. It's as if you changed cars. I am a poor driver. If I change cars, will I suddenly drive well?
No, I will continue to drive poorly. I am the same driver. Only the vehicle has changed, right? The experience continues at all times.
What I find beautiful, just to conclude since our time is up, is how much the Bardo offers us values for living. Because there is no point in trying to memorize these things just to die well, is there? The point of the Bardo is to live well, to know what our true motivations are, to take care of our mental forms, to seek to give some metaphysical meaning to life. In other words, to search for something spiritual and inner name. That is, all these elements that it so consistently shows us. What truly holds value in life? To seek a vision of life where we consider what is truly important. To care for all the elements that truly qualify and give meaning to life. It is a book for life, not for death. Because if you do not do this in life, there is nothing you can do at the time of death.